In cities across the world, grand buildings stand as monuments to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. From the ornate facades of San Francisco's Civic Center to the palatial structures of St. Petersburg, from the exposition halls of Paris to the government buildings of Melbourne, a distinctive architectural style appears with remarkable consistency. These structures share common features: classical columns, elaborate domes, intricate plasterwork, and a scale of construction that seems, to some observers, almost incongruous with the historical narratives we've been taught about their origins. The claim at the center of this investigation is specific, that these buildings constitute architectural evidence for the existence of Tartaria, a civilization or empire that historical maps document, but that conventional history treats as merely a geographical designation rather than a unified political or cultural entity. Those who advance this claim point to the uniformity of architectural style, the advanced construction techniques, and the sheer number of similar buildings erected in a relatively short time frame as evidence that cannot be explained by the standard historical account of independent nation-states building according to shared aesthetic preferences. To understand this claim, we must first establish what Tartaria was according to documented historical sources. The term appears on European maps from the 15th through the 19th centuries, designating vast territories across northern and central Asia. Encyclopaedia Britannica's 1771 edition includes an entry for Tartary, describing it as a region of considerable extent in Asia. Historical maps by cartographers such as John Carey, published in 1806, show independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Russian Tartary as distinct geographical regions. These are not invented designations, but documented historical terms used by mapmakers and geographers of the period. The conventional historical understanding treats Tartary or Tartaria as a European exonym, a name applied by outsiders to territories inhabited by various Turkic and Mongolic peoples. According to mainstream scholarship, there was no unified Tartarian empire in the modern period, but rather a series of khanates, tribal confederations, and territories gradually absorbed by the expanding Russian Empire and Qing dynasty China. The architectural claim challenges this interpretation by suggesting that the buildings themselves tell a different story, one of a more unified, technologically advanced civilization whose existence has been minimized or obscured in official historical narratives. The mainstream historical account of the buildings in question attributes them to the Beaux-Arts movement, neoclassical revival, and the international exchange of architectural ideas facilitated by world's fairs and professional journals. According to this narrative, architects trained at institutions such as the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris spread a consistent architectural vocabulary across the globe, working for various national governments and private clients who desired buildings that projected authority, sophistication, and connection to classical Western civilization. The question we investigate is whether this explanation adequately accounts for the patterns observable in the architectural record. To conduct this investigation rigorously, we must examine documented evidence, construction dates, architectural plans, building permits, contractor records, and contemporary accounts. We must distinguish between what the historical record demonstrates and what it leaves uncertain. We must consider multiple explanatory frameworks without predetermined conclusions. The architecture exists. The historical term Tartaria exists. The question is how these facts relate to one another, if at all. The historical baseline for understanding Tartaria begins with documented cartographic evidence. The Abraham Ortelius Atlas of 1570, the Atrum Orbis Terrarum, depicts Tartaria as a region of Asia. The 1645 map by Joan Blau shows Magni Modulis Imperium and Tartaria as adjacent territories. By the 18th century, maps consistently designate multiple Tartaries: Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, and Muscovite Tartary. These designations appear in works by respected cartographers including Guillaume de Lisle, whose 1705 map, Carte de Tartarie, was used throughout Europe. Historical encyclopedias provide additional context. The Encyclopaedia Britannica's first edition, published between 1768 and 1771, contains extensive entries on Tartary, describing it not as a unified empire, but as vast territories inhabited by various peoples. The entry notes that the Tartars were known for horseback warfare and nomadic lifestyles, with various groups under different governance structures. Later editions gradually reduced the coverage of Tartary, with the designation disappearing almost entirely by the early 20th century. This documentary shift in terminology raises questions about what changed, the underlying reality being described, or merely the conventions of geographical designation. Russian imperial archives document the gradual incorporation of territories previously designated as Tartarian into the Russian Empire. The conquest of the Khanate of Kazan in 1552, the Khanate of Astrakhan in 1556, and the Siberian Khanate in 1598 brought vast territories under Moscow's control. The Qing dynasty similarly expanded into regions previously mapped as Chinese Tartary during the 17th and 18th centuries. According to conventional historical scholarship, this process of imperial expansion explains why the term Tartaria fades from maps, not because a civilization was erased, but because the political geography changed and more specific regional designations replaced the broader exonym. However, those advancing the architectural claim point to an apparent inconsistency. If Tartaria was simply a geographical designation for disparate nomadic peoples, they ask, why do maps depict cities, territorial boundaries, and political divisions within Tartaria? Why do some historical sources refer to Tartarian customs, trade goods, and diplomatic relations as if describing a coherent entity? The historical record on these questions is complex rather than conclusive. Now we turn to the architectural evidence at the center of this investigation. Beginning in the 1870s and extending through approximately 1915, a remarkable concentration of monumental buildings appeared in cities worldwide. The construction timeline shows specific clustering. In the United States, major structures include the San Francisco City Hall, completed in 1915, the Library of Congress Thomas Jefferson Building in Washington, completed in 1897, the New York Public Library Main Branch, completed in 1911, and the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition buildings of 1893. In Europe, the Palais Garnier in Paris was completed in 1875, the Reichstag building in Berlin in 1894, the Hungarian Parliament building in Budapest in 1904. In Russia, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow was completed in 1883. In Australia, the Royal Exhibition building in Melbourne was finished in 1880. These buildings share distinctive characteristics. They feature classical columns, often Corinthian or composite order. They employ elaborate plasterwork and sculptural ornamentation. Many include large domes, some of considerable engineering complexity. The scale is monumental, with interior spaces designed to inspire awe. The materials frequently include marble, granite, and decorative metals. The level of craftsmanship and detailing is exceptionally high, with hand-carved elements and intricate moldings. Contemporary construction photographs reveal building techniques that have prompted questions among those investigating the Tartarian claim. Photographs from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair show vast structures erected in months, though historical records indicate these were white city, temporary buildings constructed of staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber. Photographs of permanent building construction from the period show conventional techniques, brick and stone masonry, iron and steel framing, and later examples, traditional scaffolding, and large crews of workers. Building permits and architectural plans exist in municipal archives for most major structures. Documenting architects, contractors, timelines, and costs. The pattern that draws attention is not that individual buildings are mysterious, but that so many similar buildings appeared in such a compressed timeframe across such geographic distance. The architectural claim suggests this pattern is difficult to explain through conventional historical accounts of independent decision-making by various governments and institutions. Those advancing this claim argue that the uniformity suggests a common origin or inheritance of building techniques and aesthetic preferences that preceded the official construction dates. To examine this claim, we must look at documented construction processes. The Library of Congress building in Washington provides detailed records. Architectural drawings by John L. Smithmeyer and Paul J. Pells, later modified by Edward Pierce Casey, exist in the library's archives. Construction contracts list specific contractors and subcontractors. Budget appropriations appear in congressional records. Newspaper accounts from the Washington Post and Evening Star document construction progress year by year. Contemporary photographs show the building at various stages of completion, clearly depicting the construction process from foundation to finished structure. Similar documentation exists for other buildings. The Paris Opera House construction is documented through the archives of architect Charles Garnier, whose papers include detailed drawings, correspondence with contractors, and his own published account of the design and construction process. The Hungarian Parliament building's construction is documented through Hungarian government archives, architectural journals of the period, and the papers of architect Imre Steindl. These records show conventional 19th century construction, stone cut in quarries, transported by rail, shaped on site, and assembled by stonemasons using traditional techniques augmented by newly available iron framing and steam-powered equipment. Yet questions remain about certain aspects of these buildings. The speed of construction for some structures seems remarkable, even accounting for large labor forces. The level of artisan skill required for the decorative elements suggests either very large numbers of highly trained craftspeople or techniques that allowed rapid production of complex ornamentation. Contemporary accounts occasionally express surprise at the scale or speed of projects, though such expressions could simply reflect the impressive nature of the undertakings rather than anything anomalous. The architectural claim also points to buildings that exist with incomplete or ambiguous historical documentation. Some structures lack clear construction records despite their obvious age and architectural significance. In some cases, buildings attributed to specific architects show stylistic elements that differ from the architect's documented work elsewhere. In other cases, buildings officially dated to the late 19th century show signs of construction techniques or architectural features that some observers consider inconsistent with that dating. Examining specific examples requires careful analysis. The San Francisco City Hall replaced an earlier city hall destroyed in the 1906 earthquake. Photographs document the destruction and the subsequent construction of the current building, completed in 1915. However, some observers point to photographs of San Francisco from the 1850s and 1860s that appear to show substantial brick and stone buildings, and ask whether the level of architectural development visible in these photographs is consistent with the conventional narrative of a city founded in 1776 as a Spanish mission and growing explosively after the 1849 gold rush. Mainstream historians point to detailed documentation of San Francisco's growth, including property records, newspaper accounts, and extensive photographic evidence showing the city's development over time. The question of photographic evidence deserves attention. Thousands of photographs from the late 19th century document cities worldwide. These photographs show buildings at various stages of construction completion, and sometimes decay or demolition. They show architectural styles evolving over time. They show the introduction of new construction techniques, such as steel framing. The photographic record generally supports the conventional historical timeline of urban development and architectural evolution. However, those advancing the Tartarian claim sometimes point to specific photographs that they argue show inconsistencies. Buildings appearing more weathered than their official construction date would suggest, architectural details that seem inconsistent with documented construction methods, or urban landscapes that appear more developed than conventional timelines would predict. Evaluating these photographic claims requires technical analysis. Photograph dating can sometimes be verified through camera technology, photographic processes, and the presence of datable elements within images such as specific vehicles, advertisements, or known individuals. Architectural analysis can assess whether building techniques visible in photographs are consistent with stated construction dates. Weathering and decay patterns can sometimes indicate building age, though these are influenced by many variables including climate, materials, maintenance, and original construction quality. The historical record also contains accounts of massive urban fires in the late 19th century. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 destroyed much of that city. The San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906 destroyed most of that city's downtown. The Great Boston Fire of 1872 destroyed much of Boston's commercial district. Fires in Seattle in 1889, in Baltimore in 1904, and in numerous other cities destroyed significant portions of urban infrastructure. Those investigating the Tartarian claim sometimes point to these fires as suspiciously clustered in time and ask whether they might have served to destroy evidence of pre-existing architecture that contradicted official historical narratives. Conventional historians note that 19th century cities were highly vulnerable to fire due to wood construction, gas lighting, primitive firefighting equipment, and densely packed buildings, making major fires a common occurrence rather than an anomaly. Contemporary accounts of these fires exist in abundant detail. Newspaper reports, official investigations, insurance company records, and personal accounts document the causes, spread, and aftermath of major urban fires. The Chicago Fire, for example, has been extensively documented through contemporary newspapers, photographs of the destruction, and subsequent investigations. The conventional explanation for the clustering of major fires in the late 19th century points to specific historical factors: the widespread use of coal and wood heating, gas lighting, industrial processes that pose fire risks, and the rapid urban growth that outpaced fire safety infrastructure. The rebuilding that followed these fires produced the concentration of Beaux-Arts and neoclassical architecture that forms part of the evidence cited in the architectural claim. After the Chicago Fire, the city rebuilt with an emphasis on fireproof construction and monumental architecture. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 showcased this new architectural direction. The exposition's White City featured over 200 buildings designed in a unified neoclassical style by architects including Daniel Burnham, Charles McKim, and Richard Morris Hunt. Though most exposition buildings were temporary structures, their influence on American architecture was profound and documented through architectural journals, photographs, and the subsequent careers of the architects involved. The question of architectural influence and transmission of style is central to evaluating the architectural claim. The conventional historical account explains stylistic uniformity through documented channels, architectural education, professional journals, world's fairs, and the international movement of architects. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, founded in 1648 and reorganized in the 19th century, trained architects from around the world in classical principles and design methods. Student records show Americans, Russians, Eastern Europeans, and others attending the school and then returning to their home countries to practice. Architectural journals such as The Builder in London, American Architect and Building News, and Revue Générale de l'Architecture in Paris published designs, construction techniques, and critical discussions that circulated internationally. World's fairs and international expositions served as showcases for architectural ideas. The 1851 Great Exhibition in London's Crystal Palace, the 1889 Paris Exposition featuring the Eiffel Tower, the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, the 1900 Paris Exposition Universelle, and dozens of other international exhibitions brought architects and engineers together and displayed new construction techniques and aesthetic approaches to millions of visitors. Documentation of these expositions is extensive, including official reports, architectural journals coverage, visitor accounts, and photographic records. Professional architectural organizations also facilitated the exchange of ideas. The Royal Institute of British Architects, founded in 1834, the American Institute of Architects, founded in 1857, and similar organizations in other countries published journals, held conferences, and established standards of practice. Membership lists, conference proceedings, and published papers document the international professional network of architects during the period in question. This documented network of architectural exchange provides a conventional explanation for stylistic uniformity that does not require the existence of Tartaria as a unified civilization. However, those advancing the architectural claim argue that the conventional explanation does not account for certain observed patterns. They point to buildings in remote locations with limited documented connection to European architectural centers, yet displaying similar sophisticated construction techniques. They note that some buildings attributed to specific architects show levels of technical accomplishment that seem inconsistent with the architect's training or previous work. They question whether the documented channels of architectural influence could truly account for the rapid spread of complex construction techniques across such vast distances in an era before modern communication. Examining these questions requires looking at specific technical capabilities. The construction of large masonry domes, for example, requires sophisticated engineering knowledge. The dome of the United States Capitol, completed in 1863, is a cast-iron structure weighing approximately 9 million pounds, designed by Thomas U. Walter and constructed by Montgomery C. Meigs. Technical drawings and construction records document the engineering calculations, casting processes, and assembly methods. Similar documentation exists for other major dome construction projects of the period. The engineering knowledge required for such projects was taught in technical schools, transmitted through professional mentorship, and published in engineering journals. While sophisticated, these techniques were within the documented capabilities of 19th century engineering and construction. The question of construction speed deserves closer examination. How quickly could major buildings be constructed using documented 19th century methods? The conventional historical record provides many examples with detailed timelines. The Washington Monument, begun in 1848, was not completed until 1884 due to interrupted funding, but the actual construction time totaled about 20 years of work spread over 36 years. The Brooklyn Bridge, designed by John A. Roebling and built under the direction of his son Washington Roebling, took 14 years to complete from 1869 to 1883. The Paris Opera House took 14 years, from 1861 to 1875. These timelines suggest that major monumental structures required many years of work using the construction methods of the time. However, some buildings were completed much more quickly. The Royal Albert Hall in London was built in just 3 years, from 1867 to 1870. The Glasgow City Chambers were built in 5 years, from 1883 to 1888. The Library of Congress main building took 11 years, from 1886 to 1897. Contemporary accounts sometimes expressed amazement at construction speed, but they also documented the means: large numbers of workers, industrial production of standardized components, improved transportation allowing rapid delivery of materials, and increasingly efficient construction management. Construction workforce records, where they exist, reveal the scale of labor involved. The Paris Opera House employed hundreds of workers at any given time during construction. The Library of Congress construction employed more than 1,000 workers during peak periods. These workers included specialized craftsmen, stonemasons, plasterers, sculptors, ironworkers, carpenters, as well as general laborers. The presence of such large skilled workforces raises questions about training and availability. How were so many craftsmen trained? Where did they come from? Where did they go after projects were completed? Historical records document the existence of traditional craft apprenticeship systems, trade schools, and the immigration of skilled workers. In the United States, many craftsmen working on major buildings were European immigrants who had trained in traditional apprenticeship systems in their countries of origin. Census records and city directories sometimes list occupations, providing evidence of the presence of large numbers of skilled construction workers in major cities. Trade unions, which became increasingly important in the late 19th century, kept membership records that document the number and specializations of construction workers. The question of decorative elements is particularly interesting. Many of the buildings cited as evidence for Tartaria feature extensive sculptural ornamentation, elaborate plasterwork, and intricate detailing. Creating such elements by hand would require thousands of hours of skilled labor. However, the late 19th century saw the development of industrial processes for producing decorative elements. Pressed metal panels could replicate hand-carved details. Plaster molds allowed rapid reproduction of complex ornamental designs. Standardized architectural elements could be ordered from catalogs and shipped by rail. The Mesker Brothers Iron Works, for example, produced pressed metal building facades that could be ordered and installed relatively quickly, giving modest commercial buildings the appearance of elaborate classical architecture. Technical manuals from the period document these industrial production methods. The Plasterer's Manual, published in 1897, Sheet Metal Workers Instructor, from 1902, and similar technical guides explain how decorative elements were mass-produced and installed. The existence of these industrial methods complicates the interpretation of elaborate architectural ornamentation. Does the widespread presence of such ornamentation suggest a unified civilization with advanced techniques? Or does it simply reflect the industrial production methods that were developing and spreading during the late 19th century? The question of architectural plans and construction documents is significant. Most major buildings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries have surviving architectural drawings, specifications, and construction documentation. These documents exist in archives, libraries, and institutional records. They show the design process, structural calculations, material specifications, and construction sequences. They typically bear the names of specific architects, engineers, and contractors. They include dates, costs, and approval signatures from relevant authorities. However, not all buildings have such documentation. Some structures lack clear architectural records despite their apparent age and significance. In some cases, city hall fires, archive losses, or simple neglect have resulted in missing documentation. In other cases, buildings that clearly existed in the 19th century lack conclusive evidence of when they were constructed or by whom. This absence of documentation can have innocent explanations. Record-keeping practices varied, archives have been lost to fire, flood, or neglect, and some buildings may have been constructed through informal processes that generated minimal paperwork. But the absence also creates space for alternative interpretations. Those advancing the Tartarian claim sometimes point to buildings with missing or ambiguous documentation as potential evidence of pre-existing architecture. The challenge with this argument is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, nor is it conclusive evidence of presence. A building lacking construction documentation might have been built exactly when conventional history suggests, but simply lacks surviving records, or it might have a different history than officially stated. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires careful analysis of the building itself, construction techniques, materials, architectural style, and physical evidence of modification or alteration. Architectural analysis can sometimes reveal buildings' histories through physical evidence. Different construction techniques leave distinctive traces. Hand-cut stone shows tool marks characteristic of specific periods. Brick bonding patterns changed over time. Iron and steel framing techniques evolved. Mechanical systems, plumbing, heating, electrical wiring, were installed using methods specific to particular periods. Later modifications often leave evidence. Different materials, different techniques, modifications to original design, or patches and repairs visible upon close inspection. Some buildings cited in the Tartarian claim show evidence of complex construction histories. Structures that appear unified in style sometimes reveal, upon detailed examination, multiple construction phases. Buildings officially attributed to a single construction period sometimes show evidence of earlier foundations or incorporated earlier structures. Modifications, additions, and reconstructions over time can create buildings whose final appearance suggests a single unified construction, but whose physical fabric reveals a more complex history. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago serves as a particularly significant case study for examining the architectural claim. The exposition covered more than 600 acres and included over 200 buildings designed in a unified neoclassical style. The White City, created for the exposition, was built in approximately 2 years and was visited by more than 27 million people. Photographs extensively document the construction, the completed exposition, and the subsequent demolition of most structures. Contemporary accounts, including official exposition reports, newspaper coverage, and visitor diaries, provide detailed descriptions. Those investigating the Tartarian claim sometimes suggest that the exposition buildings were not temporary structures built for the fair, but rather pre-existing Tartarian architecture repurposed for the event. They point to photographs showing apparently substantial structures, and question whether such buildings could have been constructed in 2 years and then demolished shortly after. The conventional historical account explains that most White City buildings were constructed of staff, a temporary material consisting of plaster mixed with fiber on wooden frames. These buildings were designed to last only for the duration of the exposition. Detailed construction photographs show wooden framing and the application of staff material. Contemporary accounts specifically discuss the temporary nature of the construction. The few permanent buildings, such as the Palace of Fine Arts, which still stands as the Museum of Science and Industry, were constructed of more durable materials and took longer to build, with construction records documenting the process. The exposition's influence on American architecture is well documented through subsequent building trends, the City Beautiful movement, and the careers of architects involved. Daniel Burnham, the exposition's chief of construction, went on to design major buildings and urban plans influenced by the exposition's aesthetic. The exposition established neoclassical architecture as a dominant style for American public buildings for decades afterward. This documented influence through normal architectural channels provides a conventional explanation for the subsequent proliferation of similar buildings without requiring the existence of a hidden civilization. The international nature of similar architectural developments is significant to the architectural claim. Buildings with similar characteristics appeared not only in the United States, but also in Europe, Russia, South America, Australia, and elsewhere during the same general period. Those advancing the claim suggest that this geographic spread is difficult to explain through conventional historical accounts of independent development. However, historical records document extensive international architectural exchange during this period through the mechanisms previously discussed: architectural education, professional journals, world's fairs, and the international movement of architects and craftsmen. Russian architecture of the period provides an interesting case. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw extensive construction in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and other Russian cities. The style often blended Russian national elements with neoclassical forms. Buildings such as the Grand Kremlin Palace, completed in 1849, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, completed in 1883, and numerous palaces and public buildings show sophisticated construction techniques and elaborate ornamentation. Russian architectural journals, training institutions, and the documented influence of European-trained architects provide a conventional explanation for these developments within the framework of Russian imperial expansion and modernization under the Romanov dynasty. The question of construction materials and their sourcing is relevant to evaluating construction timelines and capabilities. Major buildings required enormous quantities of materials: stone, brick, iron, steel, glass, wood, plaster, and decorative metals. Historical records document quarries, brickworks, iron foundries, and other industrial facilities that supplied construction materials. Transportation records show the movement of materials by rail and ship. Trade publications and business directories list suppliers and manufacturers. This documented industrial infrastructure supports the conventional account of how buildings were constructed. However, questions arise about whether this documented infrastructure had sufficient capacity to supply all the construction occurring simultaneously. In the United States alone, thousands of major buildings were constructed between 1870 and 1915, along with exponentially more ordinary structures. In cities worldwide, this same period saw massive construction booms. Those investigating the Tartarian claim sometimes question whether the documented quarries, factories, and transportation systems could have supplied all this construction, suggesting that some buildings must have existed prior to their official construction dates. Evaluating this claim requires examining production capacities. Quarrying, brickmaking, and iron production were major industries in the late 19th century. Production records, where they survive, show substantial output. The expansion of rail networks dramatically increased the ability to transport heavy materials. The industrialization of production processes increased output per worker. Contemporary trade publications document the scale of these industries, and sometimes express concern about overproduction or competition rather than shortage. While comprehensive records allowing precise calculation of total material production versus total material requirements do not exist, the available evidence suggests industrial capacity was generally adequate to meet construction demands, particularly given that construction occurred over decades rather than all at once. The question of power sources for construction deserves attention. Moving heavy stones, lifting materials to great heights, and operating machinery requires power. In the mid-19th century, construction sites relied primarily on human and animal power supplemented by simple machines, pulleys, levers, cranes, and winches. By the late 19th century, steam power became common on construction sites, powering hoists, cranes, and stone-cutting equipment. Contemporary photographs often show steam engines and boilers at construction sites. Technical journals document the introduction and spread of steam-powered construction equipment. The development of these power sources provides a documented explanation for the increased scale and speed of construction during the period in question. The role of world's fairs and international expositions in spreading architectural styles and construction techniques cannot be overstated. Between 1851 and 1915, hundreds of international expositions were held worldwide. Major events included the London Great Exhibition of 1851, the Paris Expositions of 1855, 1867, 1878, 1889, and 1900, the Vienna Exposition of 1873, the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876, the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, the Omaha Trans-Mississippi Exposition of 1898, the Buffalo Pan-American Exposition of 1901, the St. Louis, Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904, and the San Francisco Panama Pacific Exposition of 1915. These expositions attracted millions of visitors, featured architecture from around the world, and were extensively documented through official reports, photographs, and contemporary publications. The exposition served multiple functions relevant to architecture. They showcased new construction techniques and materials. They demonstrated aesthetic possibilities. They allowed architects to see diverse approaches to design problems. They created professional networks among architects, engineers, and craftsmen. They influenced public taste and expectations for civic architecture. The documented influence of these expositions provides a conventional explanation for architectural uniformity without requiring a hidden civilization. The transition from one architectural style to another is also significant. The buildings cited as potential Tartarian evidence generally date from the 1870s to 1915, a period dominated by neoclassical and Beaux-Arts styles. Before this period, other styles predominated: Gothic Revival, Italianate, Second Empire. After this period, new styles emerged: Art Deco, Modern, International style. Historical records document this stylistic evolution through architectural journals, critical writings, and the training programs of architectural schools. The conventional account treats the Beaux-Arts period as one phase in ongoing architectural evolution, influenced by broader cultural currents, technological capabilities, and changing aesthetic preferences. Those advancing the Tartarian claim sometimes point to the relatively abrupt nature of stylistic changes as evidence of discontinuity rather than evolution. Why, they ask, did ornate neoclassical architecture suddenly fall out of favor in the 1920s, replaced by stripped-down modernist approaches? Why did construction techniques that had produced elaborate ornamentation for decades suddenly shift towards simplified forms? The conventional historical explanation points to changing cultural values after World War I, the influence of modernist architectural theorists, and economic factors that favored more cost-effective construction. The Tartarian interpretation might suggest that the older ornate style represented inherited knowledge or techniques that were deliberately abandoned. The question of building demolition is significant to the architectural claim. Many elaborate 19th century buildings have been demolished over the past century. Urban renewal projects, changing economic uses, deterioration, and shifting aesthetic preferences have led to the destruction of thousands of buildings that would qualify as evidence in the architectural investigation. Those investigating the Tartarian claim sometimes suggest these demolitions were systematic efforts to erase evidence. The conventional explanation points to normal urban evolution, economic pressures, and the practical difficulties of maintaining old buildings. Demolition records, where they exist, typically show mundane reasons for destruction. Buildings needed expensive repairs, land was worth more for new development, structures didn't meet modern codes or functional requirements, or maintenance costs exceeded economic value. Historical preservation movements emerged in part as responses to this demolition wave, with organizations like the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the United States, founded in 1949, and similar organizations worldwide working to protect significant buildings. The existence of these preservation efforts, and their documented struggles to save buildings from economically motivated demolition supports a conventional explanation of demolition patterns. The treatment of Tartaria in historical sources shows a documented evolution. As noted earlier, 18th and early 19th century maps and encyclopedias include extensive discussion of Tartary. By the late 19th century, coverage decreases. By the early 20th century, the term has largely disappeared from geographical works. This documentary evolution can be interpreted in multiple ways. The conventional historical interpretation holds that more accurate geographical knowledge replaced the catch-all term Tartary with specific designations for regions, peoples, and political entities. As European exploration, trade, and colonial expansion increased direct knowledge of Asian territories, the vague exonym Tartary became obsolete. An alternative interpretation might suggest that this documentary evolution represents a deliberate erasure of a civilization from the historical record. Evaluating these competing interpretations requires examining what replaced Tartary in geographical and historical works. Late 19th and early 20th century sources refer to specific entities. The Russian Empire's expansion into Siberia and Central Asia, the Qing dynasty's control of territories previously designated Chinese Tartary, various Central Asian khanates, and tribal groups identified by specific ethnonyms rather than the general term Tartar. This increased specificity in designation is consistent with improved geographical knowledge rather than erasure. The question of linguistic evidence is relevant. If Tartaria existed as a unified civilization, linguistic traces should remain. The conventional historical account documents various Turkic and Mongolic languages spoken across the territories historically designated as Tartary, with these languages showing relationships consistent with documented migrations and cultural connections. Tatar, still spoken today, is a Turkic language with documented history and development. No linguistic evidence suggests a separate unified Tartarian language distinct from the documented Turkic and Mongolic language families. However, those investigating the Tartarian claim sometimes point to place names, architectural inscriptions, or linguistic elements they consider anomalous. The role of governmental and institutional archives is crucial to this investigation. Official records provide documentation for construction projects, land ownership, governmental decisions, and institutional development. These archives exist in national libraries, state and provincial archives, municipal records offices, and institutional collections. They include building permits, construction contracts, property deeds, tax records, census data, and correspondence. This documented bureaucratic record provides the foundation for conventional historical accounts of urban development and architectural construction. The reliability and completeness of archival records must be assessed carefully. Archives are not comprehensive. Many records have been lost, destroyed, or never created. Record-keeping practices varied by jurisdiction and period. Some archives have been deliberately purged for political reasons. Others have suffered from neglect, inadequate storage, or disasters such as fire and flood. The gaps and absences in archival records create interpretive challenges. Do missing records indicate normal attrition and incomplete record keeping, or do they suggest deliberate erasure? Evaluating this question requires comparative analysis. If records related to Tartarian architecture were systematically destroyed, we would expect to see patterns. Disproportionate loss of records from specific periods, types of records, or geographical areas. A comprehensive survey of archival holdings related to 19th century construction across multiple jurisdictions shows typical patterns of record survival, better preservation for more recent periods, better survival of official governmental records than private documents. Geographical variation based on archive quality and historical circumstances. This pattern is consistent with normal archival attrition rather than systematic erasure, though it does not definitively rule out selective destruction. The question of motivation arises when considering claims of historical erasure. Why would evidence of Tartaria be suppressed? Those advancing the claim sometimes suggest that acknowledging Tartaria's existence would undermine nationalist historical narratives, challenge existing power structures, or reveal uncomfortable truths about the origins of modern civilization. The conventional historical response points out that similar grand civilizations, the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire, are extensively documented and acknowledged without undermining modern states. The existence of a historical Tartarian empire or civilization, if documented evidence supported it, would be incorporated into historical understanding rather than suppressed. Comparing the Tartarian claim to other historical civilizations that have been recovered or better understood through archaeological and historical research is instructive. The Hittite Empire, known from biblical and Egyptian references, but whose full extent was not understood until 20th century archaeology, provides an example of a civilization whose existence was confirmed through accumulating evidence. The extent of Viking exploration and settlement, including the Norse presence in North America, was established through archaeological finds and careful analysis of saga accounts. The sophistication of pre-Columbian American civilizations has been increasingly recognized as archaeological evidence accumulates. These cases show that historical understanding does evolve as evidence emerges, but they also demonstrate the types and quality of evidence required for scholarly consensus to shift. The archaeological record relevant to territories historically designated as Tartary has been extensively studied. Archaeological work in Central Asia, Siberia, and northern China has revealed much about the peoples who inhabited these regions. Evidence includes settlements, burial sites, artifacts, and architectural remains. This archaeological evidence documents various cultures, Scythian, Mongolic, Turkic, and others, with distinctive material cultures and historical developments. The archaeological record shows continuity and change over time consistent with documented historical processes of migration, conquest, and cultural evolution. No archaeological evidence has been presented that would support the existence of a unified advanced civilization distinct from these documented cultures. The relationship between the Tartarian claim and broader questions about historical methodology deserves consideration. How do we establish historical truth? What constitutes adequate evidence for historical claims? When should prevailing historical interpretations be challenged? These are legitimate questions in historical scholarship. The Tartarian claim, whatever its merits, raises important issues about how we evaluate evidence, how we account for gaps in the historical record, and how open we should be to alternative interpretations of familiar data. Mainstream historical methodology requires multiple forms of corroborating evidence. A claim about past events is strengthened when documentary evidence, archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, and material evidence all point in consistent directions. The claim becomes more convincing when it explains anomalies in the existing record, when it generates testable predictions that are confirmed, and when it provides a more parsimonious explanation for observed phenomena than existing theories. Applying these standards to the Tartarian claim reveals its weakness. The claim relies heavily on one type of evidence, architectural similarity, while lacking corroboration from documentary, archaeological, and linguistic sources. The architectural evidence itself requires careful interpretation. Similarity in style does not necessarily indicate common origin. Architects working independently can arrive at similar solutions when addressing similar problems with similar constraints. The neoclassical style draws on ancient Greek and Roman precedents that were studied and admired across cultures. The technical requirements of large masonry structures impose certain constraints that lead to similar solutions. The aesthetic preferences of the late 19th century, influenced by shared cultural values and international exchange, reasonably explain stylistic similarities without requiring a hidden civilization. Moreover, the buildings cited as evidence show variation upon examination. While sharing general characteristics, they differ in details, construction techniques, materials, and specific design solutions. These variations are consistent with independent construction by different architects and builders working within a shared aesthetic tradition. If the buildings were inheritances from a unified Tartarian civilization, we might expect greater uniformity in technical details and construction approaches. The observed pattern of general stylistic similarity combined with specific technical and detailed variations matches the conventional explanation better than the Tartarian hypothesis. The question of photographic evidence returns our focus to documentary materials. Thousands of photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show cities, buildings, and construction processes. Stereoscopic views, postcards, architectural photographs, and amateur snapshots provide a rich visual record. This photographic evidence generally supports conventional historical timelines. Photographs show cities growing over time, buildings under construction, and architectural styles evolving. Specific photographs cited by Tartarian claim proponents as showing anomalies typically allow alternative interpretations more consistent with conventional history when examined in full context. Photographic analysis requires technical expertise. Dating photographs involves examining photographic processes, paper types, printing methods, and image content. Authenticating photographs requires ruling out manipulation or misattribution. Interpreting photograph content requires understanding photographic conventions, perspective effects, and the limitations of historical photographic technology. When such analysis is applied to photographs cited in support of the Tartarian claim, the results generally support conventional dating and interpretation. The economic context of late 19th century construction is relevant to understanding the building boom. This period saw unprecedented economic growth in industrializing nations, accumulation of capital through trade and industrial profits, and investment in public infrastructure. Governments, institutions, and wealthy individuals had both the resources and the motivation to commission monumental architecture. Buildings served as symbols of national pride, municipal achievement, corporate success, and individual wealth. This economic and social context explains the concentration of major construction without requiring alternative historical frameworks. Financial records, where they survive, document the costs of major buildings. The Library of Congress building cost approximately $6.5 million, a substantial sum at the time. The Paris Opera House cost more than 36 million francs. These documented costs, paid through governmental appropriations or private financing with paper trails, support the conventional account of buildings being constructed when and how official records indicate. If buildings actually predated their official construction dates, we would need to account for the documented expenditure of funds supposedly used for construction. The question of technological capabilities is central to evaluating claims about construction speed and sophistication. Could the documented technological level of late 19th century civilization produce the buildings in question? The historical record shows that it could. The period saw major advances in engineering, materials science, construction techniques, and industrial production. Iron and steel framing enabled larger structures. Portland cement allowed stronger concrete. Steam power, and then electric power enabled more efficient construction. Improved transportation allowed materials to be sourced from greater distances. These documented technological advances explain why the late 19th century saw more ambitious construction than earlier periods. Contemporary engineering journals document the technical achievements of the period. Articles describe specific construction challenges and their solutions, novel applications of materials, and innovations in structural design. These journals show a profession advancing through accumulation of knowledge, experimentation, and systematic application of engineering principles. The progression of capabilities documented in these journals is consistent with the building record and does not require invoking unknown advanced techniques. The question remains, what would constitute definitive proof of Tartaria's existence as an advanced civilization? Scientific and historical standards require evidence that cannot be explained by conventional frameworks. For Tartaria, such evidence might include architectural elements showing construction techniques unknown in documented 19th century practice, materials or material combinations not available through documented supply chains, consistent dating of buildings to periods earlier than official records indicate through multiple independent dating methods, documentary evidence from the period explicitly describing Tartaria as a unified civilization rather than a geographical designation, or archaeological evidence of settlements, infrastructure, or material culture inconsistent with documented historical cultures, but consistent with a Tartarian civilization. No such evidence has been presented that withstands scholarly scrutiny. The buildings exist, and they are indeed impressive. The architectural style is indeed widespread and remarkably consistent. The construction timeline is indeed compressed compared to earlier historical periods. But all of these observations can be explained within conventional historical frameworks through documented mechanisms of architectural education, professional exchange, technological advance, economic development, and shared cultural values. The question of why the Tartarian claim has gained attention in recent years is itself historically interesting. The rise of digital communication has enabled rapid sharing of photographs, documents, and interpretations. Online communities can collectively examine evidence and develop alternative historical narratives. Distrust of official institutions and expert consensus, whether justified or not, creates receptivity to alternative explanations. The genuine complexity and occasional gaps in the historical record provide openings for alternative interpretations. These social and technological factors help explain the claim's visibility without necessarily validating it. The documentary question must be answered on the basis of evidence. Do the buildings prove Tartaria existed? The historical record shows that Tartaria existed as a geographical designation for territories in Asia inhabited by various peoples. This is not disputed. The question is whether these buildings prove Tartaria existed as a unified advanced civilization whose architectural achievements have been misattributed to late 19th and early 20th century construction. The evidence does not support this claim. The buildings in question have documented construction histories, architects, contractors, timelines, costs, and contemporary accounts. The stylistic similarity can be explained through documented channels of architectural education and professional exchange. The construction techniques are consistent with documented late 19th century capabilities. The timeline is consistent with the documented economic, social, and technological context of the period. No physical, documentary, archaeological, or linguistic evidence requires or even strongly suggests a Tartarian origin for these buildings. This conclusion does not mean every detail of conventional historical accounts is accurate. Historical understanding is always provisional, subject to revision as new evidence emerges. Gaps and uncertainties exist in the record of any historical period. Some buildings may have more complex construction histories than official accounts suggest. Some architectural influences may be incompletely documented. The historical process is messier and more complicated than simplified narratives suggest. But complexity, uncertainty, and incomplete documentation are not equivalent to evidence for alternative civilizations. The Tartarian claim requires not just that conventional history be incomplete, which it certainly is, but that it be fundamentally wrong about major documented events and processes. Such a claim requires extraordinary evidence. The architectural similarities that constitute the primary evidence for the claim can be, and have been, explained more parsimoniously through conventional historical mechanisms. The investigation reveals something important about how we evaluate historical claims. Patterns that seem mysterious or anomalous from one perspective often become comprehensible when examined in full context with attention to documented mechanisms and processes. The impressive buildings of the late 19th and early 20th centuries seem to require extraordinary explanation only if we ignore or discount the documented economic, technological, social, and cultural factors that motivated and enabled their construction. The title's question, whether architecture proves Tartaria existed, assumes that proof operates through simple demonstration. The investigation shows that historical proof is more complex, requiring multiple forms of corroborating evidence, ruling out alternative explanations, and demonstrating that a proposed explanation accounts for observed phenomena better than existing theories. By these standards, the architecture does not prove Tartaria existed as an advanced civilization, though it does demonstrate the impressive achievements of documented late 19th and early 20th century civilization. What remains is the fascination these buildings inspire and the legitimate questions they prompt about historical processes. How did societies accomplish such monumental construction? How did architectural knowledge and techniques spread across vast distances. How did economic systems generate the resources for such projects? How did social and political factors motivate investment in monumental architecture? These are worthy questions that can be investigated through rigorous historical research using documented evidence. The buildings stand as testaments to human achievement, not to a lost civilization, but to the documented civilizations that created them. They represent the culmination of classical architectural traditions transmitted through centuries of study and practice, the application of advancing engineering knowledge, the mobilization of economic resources through industrial capitalism, the expression of cultural values emphasizing grandeur and permanence, and the skill of thousands of architects, engineers, craftsmen, and laborers whose work is documented in archives, photographs, and the buildings themselves. The Tartarian claim ultimately reflects something important: the desire for mystery, the appeal of hidden history, and the recognition that the past is strange and sometimes difficult to comprehend. These impulses are not necessarily wrong, but they must be channeled into rigorous investigation rather than conclusion-driven interpretation. The past was indeed different from simplified narratives suggest. Understanding that complexity requires careful attention to evidence, acknowledgement of uncertainty, and willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it confirms, rather than overturns, conventional understanding. The architecture exists. That historical term Tartaria exists. But the architecture does not prove Tartaria existed, as the claim suggests. Instead, the architecture proves what the documented historical record already demonstrates: that the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw remarkable achievements in construction, architecture, and urban development, accomplished through documented means by documented peoples for documented reasons. The mystery is not in hidden civilizations, but in how we understand, or fail to understand, the genuine achievements of known history.